we have not seen any benefit to bills of having renewables. So all of this talk about renewables being cheap, that is being pushed by the government, pushed by Ofgem, pushed by the system operator, it's total fiction. We would have been £90 billion better off since 2006 if we had not started the energy transition. When we first started encouraging renewables, the subsidies were sold to the public as priming the pump for immature technologies. We've been paying these subsidies for more than a quarter of a century now, so if the technology is not mature, then there's something really wrong with it. The reason we're paying the subsidies is not because of technical maturity or lack thereof, it's because the fundamental economics don't work.
The only thing worse than getting your electricity bill is a blackout. Unfortunately, the same people who warned us that the energy transition would be eye-wateringly expensive are now warning of just that: Blackout Britain. My guest today has even put a time frame on her ominous warning. I'm joined by energy consultant and blogger Catherine Porter. Thanks for coming on.
Hi.
I don't usually like to spend much time on people's history and their CV because usually I want the ideas to do the talking. But if you're going to be predicting blackouts in Britain, you probably want to mention your credibility and background. So luckily for both of us, you're not boring. Tell us about who you are and why you're able to make these alarmist claims.
Okay, well, I have some technical background. I have a master's degree in physics. I also have an MBA. I began my career in banking and eventually found my way into commodities and then specialized in energy. Spent about 10 years moving between the trading floors of commodity trading floors of banks and utilities, and then set up my own business just coming up for 9 years ago now. So I've been working in the energy sector for a couple of decades, and before that in the adjacent finance sector. And so, yeah, I've been looking at this in quite some detail for many years.
I'm from the inside and now from the outside. And it's worth mentioning you've been making a nuisance of yourself lately.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. There's a lack of accountability actually within the energy market. That spreads from the government, so the Ofgem, the regulator, and NESO, the National Energy System Operator. And they make various statements about things and are really rarely challenged on these statements. You have Ed Miliband all over the news today because the price cap has just been announced, and Ofgem as well, blaming this on gas prices. Well, yes, gas prices have gone up, but what's really interesting is in 2023, wholesale gas and electricity prices fell, but the government's own data show that household spend on electricity went up. So you can't really blame this on gas and electricity wholesale prices. And if you look back to 2020, you'll see that we had 2000, we had more than 2 decades of very low and stable wholesale prices, but retail prices were going up through that whole period, meaning that once the gas prices did go up, this whole thing was completely unaffordable. If you were to calculate, which I have, what would have been the cost to the consumer if we hadn't done the transition to renewables, we would have saved about £90 billion since 2006 if we'd just retained the spread between wholesale and household prices that we'd had from 2000 to 2006 right through to today. We have not seen any benefit to bills of having renewables. So all of this talk about renewables being cheap, that is being pushed by the government, pushed by Ofgem, pushed by the system operator, it's total fiction.
Yeah, it's such a simplistic argument anyway, given the complexities of the electricity market, which you're the expert on. But you've written this report for Net Zero Watch called Blackout Risk in the GB Grid. It predicts in the summary, and I'll quote here, as the energy transition progresses and the government pushes on to its clean power 2030 ambition, the risk of blackouts will rise. The risks become significant from the winter of 2027 to 2028 onwards. Now, we better begin by explaining some of the very basics. A blackout doesn't mean what I thought it used to mean. It's actually more of a failure of a grid that is imposed by the grid in order to protect itself, right? So take us through that.
Well, look, there are a couple of different ways that a blackout could happen. One is, and we had this in 2019, actually, that a lightning strike hit the grid that knocked out a couple of large power stations. And eventually you had this knock-on effect where about 40%, I think it was, of the country lost power. And that outage went on for about half an hour, give or take. And it was in the summer. It was about 4:30 on a late August evening. And so it didn't. The biggest impact that people had actually was with trains, because it turned out that trains can't be restarted without a laptop, and they don't carry the laptop on the train. So then people had to go traveling up and down the country to try and bring these laptops to these stranded trains to get them running again. So that was kind of fun. But then you have what you were referring to, which was sort of imposed by the grid, and that's called demand control. So if the control room sees that there's a risk of, say, a cascading blackout, where a situation like 2019, whether caused by lightning or just by a shortage of generation for other reasons, is likely to create a widespread blackout, then they will selectively disconnect regions to try and save the grid as a whole. We've never actually had a countrywide blackout since the grid was unified in 1939. And so although there is a black start procedure for restarting the grid should that happen, it's purely theoretical. It's never been tested, because obviously you're not going to turn the whole country off just so you can test it. And so the control room will take the steps it needs to try and prevent that situation arising. And winter blackouts would likely cause fatalities. So it's very important to get that balance right. Even demand control is effectively a blackout in that region where it's being turned off. And so if you're doing that in the winter, that could cause deaths. And so there's quite a high barrier, high hurdle to doing that.
One of your claims, and actually part of the evidence for this growing risk, is that we're seeing a large and growing number of near misses, almost blackouts, situations where if anything else had gone wrong, it really would have resulted in a blackout. So one of those was the 8th of January 2025. Take us through what occurred.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say we're having a lot of these events. This one was the first one, and it was the tightest day in more than a decade. And really, it took the market by surprise, because we weren't expecting this degree of tightness this early in the decade, basically. A lot of people think that by the time we get to 2027, we're starting to face significant blackout risks. And this is to do with the retirement schedule of a lot of existing generation. You've got gas plant that's getting very old. You've got nuclear reactors scheduled to close. Up until about a week or so ago, we didn't know what was going to happen with the biomass plant. And although those subsidies have been, a renewal of those subsidies has been announced, that hasn't actually been confirmed yet. So there's still some risk around that. And obviously, there's also an expectation of demand increasing with electrification, although that's actually being offset quite significantly by deindustrialization. So in the end, demand is potentially going to fall despite electrification, because industry is closing, which is obviously not a good thing. So the 8th of January actually took people by surprise. And it's interesting that from the evening before, when NESO started putting out its warnings, I was getting calls from journalists and saying, yeah, don't worry, it's going to be fine. They're just signaling that it's just not business as usual, but it doesn't mean we're going to have a blackout. It doesn't mean that it's all, at risk. And then as the day progressed, it became clear that actually the market was incredibly tight. And then we had some mismanagement by NESO.
So hold on, take us through what you mean by the market being tight.
Well, we had, so demand came out higher than NESO had expected. And I've done some work around this and uncovered that NESO's demand forecasts are actually pretty inaccurate. And it's not very transparent about those forecasts. So it has actually announced an audit of the forecasts. And the market is pushing for the results of that to be public, and also for them to start increasing the granularity of the forecasts. At the moment, they only publish the day ahead error in half-hourly intervals. And over 4 years of data, the largest error was 4.7 gigawatts. Now, if you have 4.7 gigawatts averaged over half an hour, imagine what your 1 minute error could be. That could be enormous.
Let's quickly explain that, because one of the key issues with the electricity grid is that it's literally on a millisecond level that everything has to be sort of be balanced and be figured out. So as you say, a margin of half an hour, time block of half an hour could hide ridiculous variations.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really a cause for concern. And so when I started looking into this, I realized, the average error is 600 megawatts, and that's like a small gas power station. Um, and so, and again, over half an hour. So your 1 minute error there could be much bigger, and could be causing significant risk, and potentially being why we're seeing other effects on the grid, which I know you want to speak about a bit later. So, so this was one aspect. The other aspect was that the wind output turned out to be lower than expected. So you had this, and wind was already expected to be low. We have 30 gigawatts of wind connected to the system. It's very rare that we get more than about 16 gigawatts being generated at any time. On that day, we had 2.5 gigawatts. Actually, 2 weeks later, it went down to 82 megawatts. Which is crazy. And then 2 days after that, it went up to 16 gigawatts, but there was a 9 gigawatt shut-off risk because there was a storm. And when wind speeds go above about 45 miles an hour, these turbines actually just turn off, and you can have you get instantaneous loss of generation. So NESO was having to do anticipatory curtailment and running gas in spinning reserve. So a massively expensive way to run the system. But anyway, back to the 8th of January. So you had higher demand than expected, you had lower wind output than expected, and pretty much everything that was available to run in the market was running. There were just two exceptions, really. Sutton Bridge and Connors Quay were both running at their stable export limit rather than their maximum export limit. NESO was concerned enough to not only issue all of these warnings through the day, but also enter into a deal with the Danish system operator to bring back one bipole of the Viking interconnector from maintenance early. So that brought back 700 megawatts. And it came back after the end of the trading window. So this was a system operator to system operator trade where the price was not agreed at the time. And wasn't agreed. In fact, I haven't checked, but before I went away, I'd been listening to the Transparency Forum, and like a month afterward, they still hadn't agreed the price. So basically, NESO wrote a blank check for this interconnector. So when they then starts talking about having had 3.7 gigawatts of spare margin, the question has to be, why were you writing these blank checks?
Yeah, let's specify that. Let's specify that a little bit more clearly. So they're required under the law to have a certain safety margin, and if it gets close to this safety margin, they issue, I think it's called a capacity notice or something like that. And your claim is that they were in violation, or that they were closer than they should have been. Their claim is, no, we had lots of backup. So to take us through that back and forth a little bit.
So the regulation they have to follow is they have to have enough spare capacity to be able to cover the single largest in-feed loss, which is 400 megawatts on the system at the moment. Both the Norwegian and the Danish interconnectors have that size. And so that means if that were to disappear suddenly because of a trip, and both of them have tripped off this winter at different times, then you could replace that generation. Now, I think they had maybe sort of 1,200 megawatts at best, so short of the 1,400 they were supposed to have. And I think part of the issue is that some of the reserves that they think they had, they just didn't have because the prices in the market were so high. These assets just ran anyway. And yes, they incur a penalty for doing that, for not staying in reserve. But the prices were high enough to make it worthwhile to pay that penalty. So, they had 648 megawatts of short-term operating reserve, and of the ones which are called BMUs, it just means that they are connected to the transmission system and you can access their data. I could see that about 300 megawatts were running, so they weren't reserve anymore. The ones that were not BMUs, I couldn't see the data, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been zero. So you can see that the amount of reserve they held was less than they thought. This is one of the problems with the numbers that NESO has been putting out there is that it's been putting it out as if assets can just instantaneously deliver. And that's just not the case. Normally what happens when you have a trip is that batteries respond straight away to that automatically. And then pumped hydro gets instructed because that can come on from 0 to full load in 16 seconds. De Norwood can run for 5 hours. And that gives enough time to fire up any gas power stations. So you had 2 at Sell, Connors Quay and Sutton Bridge. That would take them 15 minutes to get up to their maximum generation. And then Rye House was off, so that would need 25 minutes. So, these things they're not straightforward. And it's not at all clear to me that NESO thought about this when it was going through these actions on the day. It had already spent £21 million balancing the market that day. And normally it's about £2 million a day. So £21 million. And plus this blank check to the Danes, we'd had 2 big gas power stations trip earlier in the day. And Viking was coming back from maintenance, which is a very vulnerable time for an asset. It's not unusual for assets to trip when they're returning from maintenance. So there was not a good margin that day. We did come very close. Had there been a significant trip, it would have been very much down to the control room staff in terms of whether they could instruct the correct actions fast enough to avoid disaster. And in fact, I've met with Ofgem subsequently and recommended that they use this for training and do simulations around it, just to make sure the control room staff are trained to do that stuff quickly, because it's all very well sitting in the calm of a meeting room saying, oh, yes, well, we do this and then we do that. But in the moment when you've got that pressure and you can see all the market indicators going against you, you need to have that cool head to make the right choices fast enough.
And we shouldn't be relying on cool heads. I want to emphasize that you've given some examples there, but there's a few examples from a very long list of issues that you've pointed out over the years. Even just before we started the video, you told me about some interesting ones that have popped up very recently. These are designed to give people a flavor for the sorts of issues that we're facing. And all of them emphasize how close we got and how, I would say, well, as we get into this video later on, how often we get quite close to these sorts of problems. Don't for a minute anyone at home think that it's just what Catherine's pointed out. There's plenty more. We did also have a problem on the 22nd of December 2023 when the statutory limit was breached. Take us through that one, because that's sort of the next level up, right?
Yeah, so that was interesting because you had some outages and that caused a big drop in frequency. But actually it was recovered in under 57 seconds or whatever they said it was. So that didn't even make it a reportable incident, which I don't think is right. I think they should all be reportable incidents. But it's a sign of vulnerability, right? You shouldn't have this stuff happening. And it's not just, so breaching the statutory limit is very bad. The statutory limit is there for a reason, because once you go outside of that level, you really are in the danger zone. And you start running the risk that the protection measures that equipment has installed will start to engage. This really comes down to the basic physics of the electricity grid, that supply and demand need to be in balance in real time. And this impacts the frequency. And if the frequency moves outside a range that a piece of equipment is happy with, it'll disconnect itself because otherwise it can break. And so turbines, substations, power lines, everything has these fail-safes built in. So it's automatic. So once the equipment detects that the frequency's got to a certain point, then it will just disconnect itself. Now, there's been some work done in recent years to try and harden up the grid against this, and certainly to reduce the sensitivity of grid-connected equipment to the rate of change of frequency. But there's only so far that you can take that. And we've seen thousands of incidents where the frequency is going outside NESO's own operational limits. This is a smaller limit, that it has as its safety measure, if you like. So it wants to keep the frequency inside the operational limit, and then then it has the duty to keep it inside the statutory limit, and then beyond that, you're really at risk of disconnections. The fact that we've been seeing frequency drifting outside the operational limit without there being outages. So that December incident.
Let's get to that next. But before we get to that, the frequency drift issue, which absolutely fascinates me personally, I want to ask you first: what's going wrong at the NESO level? Their forecasts aren't great. They're debating whether statutory limits were breached or not, and there's all these issues, and they're fudging some statistics, and they're sort of hiding things with a half an hour block, and it all just seems a bit dodgy. What's going on?
Okay, well, I'd say that I think there is an element of dodgy in the sense that they definitely resist people questioning this. But I think a lot of it is down to how NESO is incentivized. So it's a regulated, or it has been up until recently, a regulated utility. It was being paid based on Ofgem's determination of what were reasonable costs and how those costs should be recovered from consumers. So unless Ofgem indicated some means by which it would get paid for doing certain work, there was no incentive to do the work. Now, when they announced this audit of their demand forecasting, they actually said on the call, oh, well, this hasn't been looked at in 20 to 30 years. And it's like, well, what? The market's gone through significant change in that period. How is it that you've just not looked at it in that time? And how is it that Ofgem hasn't made you look at it in that time? And so I know the answer to that, really. It's sort of organizational inertia. Unless somebody's jumping up and down saying, come on, guys, this is ridiculous. And turkeys don't vote for Christmas. They don't say, oh, let's do some more work that we might not get paid for. So that kind of breaks down. Even if people within NESO had identified the need to do the work, if that doesn't feed through into the incentives, then they wouldn't do it because they wouldn't get paid to do it, and they don't have the money to just do stuff without being paid for it, and nor should they. So there's a real question around how does that stuff come about. And I raised this with Ofgem. I said, well, it's all very well NESO saying, oh, we haven't looked at this in decades, and now we're going to have a look at it. You should have picked up on this as well. This is as much a regulatory failure as it is an operational one. And the problem is that the amount of this stuff, and we don't even want to get into the state of their IT systems, is extremely worrying.
Yeah, that's a good summary. We don't want to be too hard on them. Let's turn to frequency. So the way I think we need to do this, because frequency is so important to understand this issue overall, is I'm going to try and give a metaphor for what frequency is, and then you give your take on that metaphor and then tell us what frequency is. Okay. So the way I think people should think about this is, imagine a human body. It's got a pulse and a heart, and the heart's pumping the blood, giving you the pulse. That pulse is a bit like the frequency in the electricity system, the up and down of the pulse. The complication is that in the electricity system, you've got many hearts distributed around the body, providing the blood pressure, keeping the blood moving. And the concept to grasp here is that you don't just need to keep the blood pumping, you need all of those different hearts to beat at the same identical rhythm. Because if they don't have the same rhythm, then you get spikes of blood pressure and drops in blood pressure at different parts of the body. And it's the same with the electricity system. You've got the supply coming from the various different sources of electricity, but they have to conform to the same frequency, the same rhythm, in order for the system as a whole to work. Otherwise, you get blackouts and what's called dirty power. And like you say, the electricity will shut off because it's trying to preserve itself. So take us through what you think of that metaphor, and then explain frequency in your own words.
Well, I'm loving the idea of our power grid being like an alien. So yes and no. There's a relationship between the frequency and supply and demand, which doesn't come through that analogy. Where the frequency comes from is the basic way in which electricity is generated. So back to physics here. we have alternating current in our electricity grid, and alternating current just means that the current and the voltage vary over time. And you generate this because you have one magnet and it rotates inside the magnetic field of another magnet. And those magnets basically that rotate are mounted on the turbines. And so what you get is this sine wave that goes like this. And it's very smooth, and you get 50 cycles per second. And that corresponds to all of the turbines turning at 3,000 revolutions per minute. And they have to be synchronous, which means that they reach the top of each wave at the same time as each other, so they don't cancel each other out. So this is what you get with conventional generation. Unfortunately, wind and solar don't produce this alternating current. They produce direct current where you just have a straight line. And they have to use power electronics to convert that into the alternating current. And the way they do that is that they observe what they can see on the grid. Does this wave look like what they expect it to look like? If so, yes, great, we'll connect. If not, we won't connect. Or if we're already connected, we'll disconnect. And wind and solar are actually quite sensitive to this. And the relationship between supply and demand is that if you don't match supply and demand perfectly, you'll get variations. So it's a little bit like gas in a pipe. If you push more gas into a pipe, the pressure goes up. If you generate more electricity than you're using, the frequency goes up. And if you take out gas from the pipe, the pressure goes down. If you consume more electricity than you're generating, then the frequency will go down. And so that's why if a power station or an interconnector trips, you see this reduction in the frequency. You'll see a sudden drop in the frequency. And so that's really it. So there's sort of the full explanation of where this sort of frequency comes from.
And you mentioned the statutory and the operational. So the operational limit is the 50 hertz of frequency plus minus a 1%. That's the statutory, sorry. Then the operational is 0.4%. So these things are incredibly precise. So you talked about frequency drift earlier. You mentioned drift. It's the first time I've heard it called that. When I read a report about this, actually, I called it electric cholera because it's sort of like the disease that's transmitted through electricity, the disease that's transmitted through water. Because when frequency gets too high or too low, it actually damages electronics and sensors and electrical equipment if it's not cleaned out. That's why it's often called dirty power. So take us through that idea of just how important frequency is in order for maintaining it.
Well, as I was saying earlier, electrical equipment is very sensitive to this measure. They have fail-safes built into them to protect themselves from the frequency getting out of the range that it feels is acceptable. And so, and then that's automatic, right? So if you do get a big drop in frequency and it starts to hit that level, then you'll get different bits of generation disconnecting themselves. But obviously that causes the frequency to drop even more because now there's more generation off the system. And so other bits of generation that maybe were less sensitive will now become affected because the frequency's fallen into their range of concern. And so they disconnect. And very quickly it becomes cascading.
So your argument is that we're not just facing the issue of frequency rising and falling suddenly because an interconnector cuts out or a power station cuts out. We're also facing the issue of the frequency drifting slightly too high or slightly too low slowly. That's why you call it drift, because of instability in the power system. And I think you argue that it's caused by renewables.
Yes, I mean, what happens when you transition towards renewables is you lose something called inertia. So when we go back to conventional gas and nuclear turbines, they're big, heavy lumps of metal, and they resist changes to their speed of rotation. So if you remember that their rotation creates the 50 hertz to start with, if your frequency is varying, then that will have a backwards impact on the turbine. The turbine will then, there'll be a pressure for the turbine to change its speed of rotation. But turbines are big and heavy, and they don't easily change their speed. And this is a very helpful feature on the grid. This inertia that they have act as a brake on change of frequency. But if you start moving,
I'll just clarify that. So if you lose power generation because of the inertia of the turbines from sort of historical fossil fuel, and also hydropower is great for this, they stop spinning slower. They continue to spin at a decent speed for a respectable amount of time. Whereas, and this is where you continue.
Yeah, so if you start replacing these conventional turbines with generation that doesn't create the waveform of frequency, or the current and the voltage waveform, it's just doing it with power electronics and it's following what's on the grid already, then that makes it a lot less stable, because you don't have this brake on the change. And so all of a sudden, the word flighty is basically used. It becomes less solid. It's more, you can blow it down with a feather if you like. You could very easily change the frequency. And so we see and identify, and NESO talks about this, a reduction in inertia on the system. That reduction is going to continue. There are some markets, such as the NEM in Australia, where falling inertia has become a huge issue, and they routinely curtail renewables in order to run gas, not because they need the energy, but because they need the grid stability. And in fact, there are some parts of Australia now where you can't get a grid connection for a solar farm, for example, unless you install a synchronous condenser, which is basically a big gas turbine that doesn't generate electricity. It just provides you with that inertia. It's a big, heavy thing. They power it with electricity instead of gas, and it just acts as a brake on those changes in frequency.
It provides inertia. It's like a flywheel. So
flywheels can do it as well. But it's a good use of decommissioned turbines from conventional generation. And in fact, if you install a clutch, then you can use the same turbine both to generate electricity and to provide inertia when it's not generating electricity, because you can disconnect the generator. But this is a really important feature, both in Britain and Australia. The system operators are starting to procure this as a service. They're putting out tenders for inertia, and we'll see that in other markets as well. And obviously that costs money, because you used to get it for free from gas generators. Now you have to pay for it.
I'm sure all of this is included in the cost estimates.
Well, I'm just writing a report at the moment, actually, on the affordability of the Clean Power 2030 plan. And this is all feeding into it. If you build an energy system that's based on generation with load factors of, on average, 35%, then it stands to reason that it won't be cheaper than what you had before, and that you've got to have a whole separate system to run as backup for when it's not windy and sunny. And as I said, we had a day in January rather, zero solar in the peak because it's at night time, and 82 megawatts of wind, which is functionally zero.
Yeah, I think we have a Telegraph headline we can show people that it was generating 1% of the country. So wind as a whole was generating 1% of the country's energy.
Oh, it was much less on that day.
Even less.
Yeah. Well, 82 megawatts is usually, it's noise, basically. It's, a few people's kettles. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but it's really negligible. You wouldn't get out of bed to even talk about 82 megawatts. There's a normal gas-fired power station is about 7 to 800 megawatts. So 82 megawatts is just
at the national level, it's not very useful. We've also got this chart here of how often the frequency limits have been breached on the upper and lower side. Obviously, that's growing over time. It's interesting to me to see the upper side, right? Because it's suggesting that you're, like you said, you're pumping too much gas in the pipeline. You're producing too much energy. And I'm assuming this is just related to the instability of renewables.
Yeah, it is. And you see these big swings that renewables are intermittent in real time. So it's not just so you can have a whole day when it's not very windy. Every gust of wind or cloud going in front of the sun impacts the output of your wind and solar. And particularly on windy days, those gusts can be quite big and strong. So you can get huge sudden swishes that will, and they're almost impossible to predict. And so it's really difficult to manage these features. And I actually think that NESO has done a pretty good job of containing these drift phenomena. But again, it's not something that it's being transparent with the market on. And it's it is concerning. So yes, they're doing a good job, but if you're going to continue along this path to Clean Power 2030, and remember that in 2030, the government is saying that it wants unabated gas to only contribute to 5% of average annual demand. So it's only going to be running a few hundred hours a year. So how is it going to manage this dynamic with that little conventional generation on the system? You'll have some biomass, you'll have some hydro, and you'll have the nuclear. And I'm expecting all of the AGRs now are going to get extended to 2030. I think that the 8th of January was a real wake-up call in terms of capacity. I think that's why we've seen the biomass subsidies being renewed, in spite of opposition, that they might not be confirmed, but the government wants to renew them. I think this is all part of the same picture. So I think we will see the nuclear reactors extending as well. But this is not a good place to be, and I don't see that it's realistic to do without gas to that extent in 2030.
Yeah, that's the big story here, is that the shift that's coming. It's happened in Germany, it's happening across the EU.
I think it's inevitable, because what we've seen in recent months is a strong pushback from the electorate. So we've seen a sort of rightward shift pretty much everywhere. And although the UK just returned a Labour government with a really big parliamentary majority, they actually had a very small share of the vote. And that wasn't really indicative of a shift to the left. It was just an indicator of fatigue with a very sort of tired Conservative administration. So what we're seeing everywhere really is a rightward swing among voters, and identifying this issue of high energy prices being economically damaging. In Germany, the thing that really cut through to voters there was when VW announced its factory closures, and people suddenly realized this is the impact, this is the consequence of these net zero policies.
One of the things about your work that makes it brilliant is there's all these facts we've been told that, renewables will make electricity cheaper, batteries will solve the intermittency, interconnectors make our electricity system more stable and reliable. And you don't just debunk them, you point out the opposite's true. And I think your arguments about interconnectors are especially interesting. The idea of interconnectors was that, yes, wind and solar are intermittent, but it's always windy somewhere in Europe and it's always sunny somewhere in Europe, right? And you point out that's not the case. So take us through what's wrong with interconnectors and how actually they make us more vulnerable instead of less vulnerable.
So interconnectors is starting to be quite a hot topic as well. So we're connected with, I suppose, three different groups of people. We've got Norway, which is primarily a hydro-based system, France, which is nuclear, and then everyone else, which is primarily wind. And I'm sort of ignoring Ireland, because Ireland acts as demand on the GB grid. We always export to Ireland. So I sort of exclude Ireland for these purposes, in the same way that I don't look at Wales and Scotland, for example. So we have high weather correlation with everyone except for Norway. Norway built its interconnectors originally because it wanted to be able to ride through dry years. And then as a secondary factor, in very wet years, it wanted to be able to generate electricity from surplus water rather than just spilling it. Two interconnectors, very large ones, 1.4 gigawatts each, with Germany and Britain, opened in 2021. In 2022, Norway had an exceptionally dry year, 20-year reservoir lows in the south of Norway, in the region where these interconnectors connect into the country. Now, the intention was that would allow Norway to import electricity to mitigate this dry year. But what happened was they exported. And so Norwegian prices in the south of Norway went up by a factor of 10. Since then, the government has subsidised end users to either 80 or 90% of their bills. They've just recently increased it back to 90%. And it's become a huge issue with voters. There was a really good piece in the Telegraph this week where the reporter had actually gone and interviewed people on the street in Norway, and they were talking about how betrayed they felt with these interconnectors, having imported all this volatility into the Norwegian market, how it's not what they signed up for. They didn't spend all this money on their hydro system just to export the benefits and import other people's downsides. And then they look at Britain prematurely closing coal power stations and Germany prematurely closing nuclear. And they're like, you're making these choices without any consultation with us. And a direct result of these choices is our prices are going up and becoming more volatile. So all of the parties in the Storting now agree that they don't want any more interconnectors, and about half of them want to renegotiate the deals with Britain and Germany. And Europe's idea of cross-border cooperation is that I'm going to act in my own best interest, and I expect you to act in my best interests as well. And Norway's basically said that doesn't work for us. And Norway's in a really strong position here because Europe's relying on Norway for its gas as well as electricity. And you really just can't force somebody to export to you. And so I do expect, they've already amended their Energy Act twice to give themselves the powers to restrict exports. I expect we're going to see further restrictions, but probably not this side of their elections in September. How far they go with this will depend on who wins those elections. But the party that's currently leading in the polls is extremely anti-interconnection and definitely wants to renegotiate these deals. So we'll have to see. The plug on this could be pulled quite soon, and that would have quite a negative impact on the GB market. It would have a really negative impact on Germany. And my answer to that is just tough. If you don't invest in your own dispatchable generation capacity, you can't expect other countries to do it for you.
Yeah, interconnectors allow these really weird, dodgy double countings to occur where, interconnector inflows of electricity are presumed to be green, first of all, and they're presumed to always be available, right?
Well, I don't know that they're presumed to always be available, but they're definitely treated as zero carbon, which is just greenwashing. There's no two ways about it. They're not zero carbon. If you're importing nuclear power from France or hydro from Norway, then yes, that's low carbon. But if you're importing coal through the Netherlands, then it's not. So this idea that interconnectors are automatically rated as zero carbon is a fiction. And it's just part of this wider greenwashing picture that goes on in the sector.
Why have renewables, which are supposedly free at the margin, or at least supposedly very cheap, making our electricity system more expensive?
For two reasons, really. One is that they are intermittent, and the other one is that they are low energy density. And I suppose the third reason is that they require a subsidy to get built. When we first started encouraging renewables, the subsidies were sold to the public as priming the pump for immature technologies. We've been paying these subsidies for more than a quarter of a century now. So if the technology is not mature, then there's something really wrong with it. The reason we're paying the subsidies is not because of technical maturity or lack thereof. It's because the fundamental economics don't work. And that's obvious, right? If you have something whose short-term marginal cost is close to zero, and you're being encouraged to sell at around your short-term marginal cost, how would you ever repay the cost of your capex? If you need to build an expensive machine to make something, and then you have to virtually give that thing away, you're never going to be able to pay for the machine. Like that should be obvious to anyone. So what you see with renewables is that it reduces the wholesale price. And this is why people talk about, are renewables lower prices? They reduce the wholesale price. This is true. How are we subsidizing renewables? We give them a contract for difference. That means that they receive the difference between the strike price, which is always quoted in 2012 money, so it looks way cheaper than it actually is, and the wholesale price. So the more you lower the wholesale price, the higher the amount of money you pay under the CFD. And that money goes straight onto the bill. So it doesn't ever show up in the wholesale price. It goes straight onto the retail price. So with renewables, you have a much bigger gap between the wholesale price and the retail price than you do with conventional generation. And this really misleads people. They're like, oh, we need to break the link with gas. No, we don't. It's a red herring. The amount of money that you spend on subsidies will increase if you lower the wholesale price. So yes, you could split it from gas. It would be very complicated to do, which is why the government's abandoned the idea. But if you did do it, anything you gain with one hand, you immediately take away with the other hand, because you've agreed to pay that difference to these suppliers. So unless you see the strike prices falling, then renewables won't get cheaper. But now strike prices are going up. And what's really, really suspicious is that before the previous CFD round, AR6, we already had all the information about the auction by this stage, and the auction was ready to go. Now we don't have the information, we don't have the strike prices. The government has just launched a consultation, which is going to delay everything, about potentially extending the life of the contracts from 15 to 20 years. This is just a ploy to reduce the headline number of the subsidy. So it's clear that industry has informed the government they're going to need a lot more money. And the government is like, we can't really just give you all this extra money without making some changes, because then people are going to notice that this will be the second in a row where it's gone up, and they're going to complain. They're also consulting on not announcing the budget until after the bids are in. So prioritizing volume over value. Again, that's going to be terrible news for bills. So this whole idea, this whole narrative that renewables are cheap is just a total lie. And it irritates me so much, because it should be obvious that you cannot pay for the economics of these things without subsidies that cost money. That because they have really low load factors, you need backup generation. Because they have low energy density, you need a lot more network infrastructure to connect them. A 600 megawatt CCGT, an 800 megawatt CCGT needs one grid connection. The equivalent megawatts of wind turbines, you need 65 or more wind turbines. And that's just to give you the nameplate. If the wind is only running a third of the time, you basically need 3 times as many. So, this leverages up very quickly. And then the balancing costs have gone up as well. They've gone up, more than double. They actually were at like £4 billion a couple of years ago. Now they've come down a bit because they were impacted by the gas price as well. But this is we're paying billions and billions and billions of pounds a year extra. We would have been £90 billion better off since 2006 if we had not started the energy transition.
Take us through what happens next, given what you know and understand. What's the future going to hold for our electricity system?
So I think in Britain, a lot's going to depend on the political landscape. Well, I think that's true everywhere, but specifically here in Britain, we've got a relatively new government with a huge parliamentary majority that has just done one of the worst budgets in living memory. We're struggling to get long-dated gilts sold, and the economy is really starting to look very shaky. So now we've heard Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves talking about growth and how they want to achieve growth through infrastructure. It's going to be impossible to do this in the context of the Climate Change Act. You try and build an extra runway at Heathrow, which they say they want to do, you're going to end up in court because it's going to not let you meet your carbon budgets. And actually the next one's due out tomorrow. So the only way they're going to really be able to deliver on that programme is if they amend the Climate Change Act or repeal it, which would likely prompt Ed Miliband's resignation, which would be an extremely positive step. We need to get rid of net zero zealots out of government. We need to have no zealots of any sort in government. Government and zealotry are not two things that should go together. So we need a government that's going to listen to people and listen to experts on energy. And you refer to the conversation we had before we started. Ed Miliband says that the Clean Power 2030 plan has been validated by the independent system operator, of which he, by the way, is the sole shareholder. But recent freedom of information requests have shown that NESO actually got both Ofgem and DESNZ to sign off on the report before it was published. So a report that's been validated by other people is no longer independent. It's now not independent. And so pointing to that and saying, oh, this is the proof that we can do it, is entirely just false and misleading. So a lot of what happens next is really going to depend on whether Miliband stays in post and whether the government realises that it really needs to stop this trend of deindustrialisation. We're seeing a lot of job losses now across the economy, not just energy related, but also as a result of the recent budgets with the employment taxes going up, imminently. So there really needs to be some change. Otherwise, the country is going to be bankrupt. I mean, I don't think there's only two ways about it. And we're seeing this playing out across Europe as well. France is effectively bankrupt. The causes there are different, but the effect is the same. Germany's in a terrible state. They're the only European country with a stupider energy policy than ours. But you see around the world, countries with lots of wind and solar have higher electricity prices. This is what you expect. Unless they're recovering that through taxation in some way and subsidizing bills, you see a correlation between high wind and solar and high prices. And so we need our politicians to recognize this and move on.
Let me try and summarize your claim here. So we can only pursue net zero at the expense of our grid's reliability. The more we transition to renewables, the higher risk of
we can only do that with intermittent renewables. But my view is that if we want to decarbonize the power grid, we need to use nuclear. It's zero carbon, but it's high energy density. It'll run for 60 plus years. And it's not intermittent. And once you plug it in, it'll keep going until you have to refuel it. So this cannot be said for anything else. And the supply chains and the fuel provision is relatively stable. Yes, there are some challenges in the supply chains, particularly in conversion and enrichment, but countries are taking steps to remedy that. And it's one of the few areas of the energy sector where Britain actually does have an advantage. So we should be really leveraging that. And following the example of KEPCO churning out these reactors in 8.5 years each. And that's the route to decarbonising our power grids and using gas as a bridging fuel. And the thing is, wind turbines, they have a lifespan of about 20, 25 years. So if you stopped subsidising new wind farms now and started a programme of building new nuclear reactors, you wouldn't have a particularly big crossover of having the remaining wind farms and nuclear running. And you'd also have gas. And I know Reform just wants to get rid of them all. Reform is talking about, now I don't know if it will be able to do this. It's not a bad idea, but there might be some protections within the CFD contract, which just basically wants to tax away the benefit of having the CFD in the first place. Yeah, I mean, do that, push them out of the market. These things are just bad.
But I would submit to you that what's going to happen here is we're going to end up with sort of a no man's land, the worst possible combination, right? They're going to give in and say, right, fine, we'll give in, we'll do nuclear, we'll get 40% nuclear and the rest renewables, and that's just going to cause an even worse bill spike.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not expecting particularly the current government to come up with a sensible strategy. I'm just saying that if you are serious about decarbonising the electricity grid and you want to do it in a reliable and low-cost way, the best way to do that is with nuclear, and that you should just stop doing renewables altogether. I mean, hydro is different. Hydro and geothermal are great, but I don't think we have that much scope for too much more here. But wind and solar, intermittent renewables are just dumb. Right, and they're a really, really bad use of natural resources.
Well, we've had Simon Michaud on about just how inefficient renewables are in terms of resources use. But I think your expertise in the UK market has brought to light what's going on, what's really going on, what we're not being told. I don't know about you, Catherine, though. I don't mind any of this because, if the government's correct, then a 3-day work week is now a good thing, not a bad thing. So why should we worry about any of this?
I mean, there are just no words, are there? I mean, this idea that we don't need to do it, we don't need to work, other people will just pay for our lives. Let's just, just the state will take care of everything, and then we go bankrupt, because that's inevitably what's going to happen. Nobody else is going to pay, right? So if you go back 100 years, if you didn't work, you would starve on the street. You'd be homeless and starving. And I think we've allowed welfare to cushion us so much now that we're deluding ourselves that we don't need to work for a living anymore. It's just, yeah, I just can't understand this at all. I've got two sons who are at university, and they're both very diligent and hard workers. And I've said to them, like, you're going to rule the world, because most people your age are just not interested in working, and you're interested in working. That's going to be like huge for you as you go forward in your lives.
Yeah, I think the risk to that theory is that the government mucks up the electricity system badly enough to cause trouble for all of us. Let's hope it doesn't happen. Let's hope you manage to change policy. You've already got people asking questions. You've already got people releasing information that they would rather not have out there. You're already making an impact. So I suppose from the reader's point of view, thank you for doing what you do. I hope the readers will check out your blog at What Logic. Is there anything else that you think you want to direct them to? Perhaps this report on the risk of blackouts and in the GB energy system?
Yeah, so all my reports are on my blog. So they all sort of link back to there. So yeah, check out my blog. And I just wrote quite a lengthy piece explaining the situation with Norway and the risks to interconnectors. So yeah, it's the more recent blogs since mid-December are actually quite sobering on how the energy system is working, apart from a rather fun one on AI, because it turns out that AI can't replace me just yet, which was good news.
What a relief. Catherine, thanks very much for joining us, and to everyone at home, thanks for watching. It's not all doom and gloom for our energy system. The issues that Catherine Porter described in this video have become so bad that they're now impossible to ignore. And that means change is afoot. Governments have been forced to acknowledge that we need to make vast investments in reliable forms of energy that can provide the baseload power we need. At the centre of this shift is a secret location 35 minutes outside of Oxford, which could provide the solutions we so desperately need. My colleague here at Southbank Investment Research is calling it the centre of Britain's AI railroad. To find out what is going on there and how to position your investment portfolio to profit, click the link in the description or the comments section below. It'll take you to a video presentation from our energy expert at Southbank Investment Research that reveals all. Thanks for watching.